Okay, everyone, welcome to another episode of Growing Down. And today we are joined with Bryan, is it O'Doherty? O'Doherty?
Doherty, yep.
Doherty? He's a father, an entrepreneur, and a writer, author of the Brodoland blog at brodoland.wordpress.com, and co-host of the Integrate This podcast. Great name, by the way. Both focus on integral politics, economics, and philosophy. So, Bryan, thanks for joining us in the lion's den of far leftists here.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
Great.
Bryan, I had a first question for you. Just if you could familiarize our listeners to a little bit about your background and how you got into Integral.
Sure. I was first exposed to Ken Wilber and Integral maybe when I was in college, kind of the tail end of my college years. And actually, I was in Japan. I was studying in Japan, studying abroad. I started reading him on the train, on my daily train rides. and it was just like, pow. I mean, it just really spoke to me, like all of these things that I had been have been kind of bubbling up within me, but I didn't quite have the words to kind of describe what I was feeling, what I was thinking. And he just really laid it out. And the first book I read of his was, of course, probably the most accessible. It was his Brief History of Everything. And then from there, I just started consuming his work. But yeah, that's kind of how I ran into it. Over the years, I've just continued to kind of stay in touch with it. But of course, life kind of came in. So there was a period of maybe 8 or 10 years where I wasn't really that engaged with integral stuff. I was more like, building a career, building a family, that kind of thing. And then I got back into it in sort of the late aughts, maybe 2008, 2009 or so. And I really started I had an interest in economics and politics, and I have for forever. And I kind of really wanted to see, okay, what was Integral doing in that realm? And at that time, maybe 2010, 2011, I was really disappointed because there wasn't a whole lot. I think there were a couple of videos out there of Ken Wilber sort of talking about politics in very general terms, but nothing with any great depth. So 2012, I wrote that essay about Panarchism. And actually, since 2012, there's been a lot of activity, I think, in integral circles around this issue. And that's been great. I've been really happy with that. But yeah, that's sort of how I kind of got into it and how I started writing about it and so on. So.
Cool. Yeah. And I'll just say too that I think I felt similarly to you, Bryan, in feeling kind of disappointed with the lack of a coherent political vision in Integral. And so I was really happy to find your blog back, I don't know, like 4 or 5 years ago. Because you were one of the first I found where you were actually articulating this is what an integral society looks like.
Mm-hmm.
So that was exciting for me to see. So maybe you can talk a little bit about your own political views, how you politically identify, maybe without getting too bogged down the labels and everything, and maybe also how you saw that comporting with integral theory.
Yeah. Labels are difficult. So I see myself, depending on the day of the week, I see myself as a radical centrist, an anarchist. And I favor the free market. So I'm a free market anarchist in that way, more along the lines of sort of like Rothbard or that sort of thing. But I am always careful to point out that that's my personal political stance, and that there's nothing inherently integral about my political stance. What I was trying to do with Panarchy is create something that would be integral, that would fit you know, that would paradigmatically it would be it would fit the tenets of sort of integral philosophy. So yeah, I mean, so I kind of try to separate where I stand personally in a political frame to what integral politics should do.
Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the difference between like anarchism, and like free market oriented anarchism.
Okay. Yeah, anarchism has a lot of different schools of thought. You know, there's socialists and syndicalists and basically all sorts. You know, anarchism is basically the idea that society doesn't need rulers per se. So socialist anarchists take that a step further. They say they essentially see capitalism as a source of hierarchy, or source of, you know, I guess there's two different types of hierarchy, right? There's sort of the top down. I don't know. Help me out with my words here. Sometimes I forget what I'm talking about. But
like a growth hierarchy and a dominating hierarchy.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Yes, that's kind of what I was looking for. So a dominator hierarchy. A lot, you know, socialists see capitalism as a type of dominator hierarchy, and free market anarchists don't. They see capitalism as a voluntary exchange, is at the root of it. That's what capitalism is about, is a voluntary exchange. So the market anarchists or free market anarchists don't associate capitalism with being part of the rulers that need to be dismantled in order to have a free society, I guess.
Jeremy, did you want to jump in with anything?
Yeah, well, I think I'd be kind of interested in you unpacking your understanding of what panarchy is, right? Because how do we move from anarchy and in its various associations into panarchy, and what makes that integral as opposed to, generally speaking, anarchism, or generally speaking, any other political
Sure.
orientation?
Yeah, well, I think so. I think it's a little bit opposite. So you probably won't get to panarchy from anarchy. It would probably be the other way around. You might get to anarchy from panarchy at a much maybe higher level of development. So I think what panarchy is the idea that in one regard everyone should have a certain level of sovereignty, and what that is the sovereignty to decide what type of society they want to be a part of. So in a panarchy, what you would have is basically a network or a meshwork of communities, and these communities are not necessarily you know, set in stone. So for example, they might grow, they might shrink, they might come into being, they might disappear, but you have this meshwork of communities, and these communities are all different. They're diverse. Any type of community you could imagine. It could be faith-based, it could be industry-based, it could be centered around you know, a cause, it could be anything really. And that these communities, because they are self-contained, and they are sort of, but at the same time in a larger network with other communities, they have the advantage of not creating the sort of friction that we see when an individual who has one sort of worldview lens that they see the world through is forced to live their life in a society that does not match that lens. And so from that standpoint, I think it helps us get from a place of sort of first-tier paradigms, first-tier governmental paradigms that basically favor, or they honor one V-meme, or maybe they honor, like, you know, a smaller range of V-memes, and Panarchy just takes that and just blows that up and says, okay, we're gonna honor everything, and obviously you want to do that in the healthiest way possible. I don't know if that answered your question, but
Oh yeah, that so I guess like a follow-up to that would be more of like a historical biographical question, which is, you published this in 2012. Do you see, to what degree did the political and economic climate of Occupy, you know, the bailout from 2007, 2008, and the sort of the political social foment that was happening around that time, how did that influence the writing of this essay? And then I'm very curious what the response was by the integral community at that time to the concept of panarchy. So what did other integralists kind of, how did they receive it?
So to answer the first part of your question, yes, I do think that had an impact on my thinking. I was actually very excited when for both the Occupy movement and the Tea Party movement. I thought both of those were very sort of cool kind of outsprings of sort of civic angst, if you will. And both had points to make, and they kind of almost had the same point to make. I mean, they were going after the same target, which is this, whatever you want to call it, whether you want to call it the 1% or whether you want to call it sort of the sort of kleptocratic oligarchs that sort of rule what we call a democracy. You know, I think all of us have this feeling that something's not right. Something's not right with what's going on, and whether you're on the left or the right, I think people on the left and people on the right, you know, they have a lot more in common than you might think. They just see the world slightly differently, and so part of what I wanted to do with Panarchy was to say, hey, you know, maybe there's a better way that all of these people who see the world differently can kind of come together and have a harmonious society. And then so I wrote it. I published it on Integral World. Actually, I tried to publish it in, can't remember the name of the journal, but it was the main journal at the time.
Integral Review, was that it? Or
Integral Review,
Leadership?
yeah, I think that's what it was. Yeah, so I tried to publish it there first. I actually got pretty far along in the review process before they decided not to publish it. And then I just published it at Integral World. And the reaction was mostly positive, but I think it didn't get very much traction. In other words, I don't think a whole lot of people saw it. But those that did, reacted fairly well to it. I got quite a lot of good feedback on it. And that actually led to me continuing to write about it because of the feedback I got. You know, I was moved to, you know, continue writing about it.
I'm just curious. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Brian.
Oh, I was just going to add that, you know, as time went on, the idea has gained more and more traction, I think, to the point where actually I was shocked when Rob Smith actually talked about Panarchy at his address for his, gosh, I can't even remember what the, what's that?
This is a great release.
The Great Release.
Great Release. Thank you.
Mm.
I have problems remembering stuff like this, but anyway, yes, the Great Release. So he did a talk on that, and he mentioned Panarchy as sort of the operating system, the next operating system that would come into play. Now, whether or not we see eye to eye on what Panarchy is a totally separate matter. But the fact that the idea of Panarchy was sort of mainstreamed by Rob was pretty big deal, I thought. At least for me, it was.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So I guess I'm curious about how panarchy, as you see it, is distinct from like what we have now, in the sense that if I'm a more liberal person, I could move to California. If I'm more conservative, I could move to Alabama, or I could leave the country and go to the Nordic countries if I want more of a democratic socialist system, or I could move to Hong Kong or something if I want more libertarian. You know what I mean? So like, how would that be in terms of the self-organization of people voluntarily choosing the right environment for them? How that would be different from just life as it is today?
Well, I think what the main difference is that in a panarchy, there are no territorial sort of lines in the sand. So you don't have to move. I mean, you could change your affiliation, I suppose, is another way to put it, and still remain where you're at. It eliminates the territorialness. It eliminates so for example, if I want to move to another country, I have to change my citizenship, and there's a whole process to that. There's immigration, right? Well, Panarchy doesn't have any of that. It is not I would say it is kind of a step between a government and anarchy. So it's not quite anarchy, because there are still some frameworks. There are still some, you might have a charter or a constitution or something that all of these little communities have to abide by. So it's not like there's a complete lack of like a government apparatus, but it's minimized to such a degree that that you're essentially you're pretty close. You're pretty close to anarchy there. I don't know. I don't know if you sort of I don't know how much you read into kind of what I wrote, but it does require a certain developmental level, sort of, I guess, center of gravity for a society. Like you couldn't just plop panarchy into our current situation and expect it to function correctly. So there does need to be a sort of developmental sea change in society as a whole. In other words, the dominant V meme needs to be integral. Otherwise, it won't work, because you just won't have the depth, I guess, for it not to devolve into some sort of first tier, government. So I think that's one.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So would you say then, like, for integral, are you saying it needs to be like the society center of gravity, or are you saying it needs to be the leading edge for it to flourish, in your opinion?
Well, I think, yeah. So you're saying, does it need to be like, does the top 10% need to be at integral, or are you talking about, yeah.
Well, I would say right now, I don't know, where do you see today's society being, like, the center of gravity being at?
Well, in the US,
yeah.
I would say it's probably kind of a mixture of orange and green.
Okay.
Somewhere in there.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, and that may be, so I see what you're saying. You're saying probably the majority of Americans are still at amber,
mm-hmm.
but the zeitgeist, sort of the way our society operates, is sort of rooted in late orange, early green, I would say.
Yeah. So for panarchy to flourish, are you saying the center of gravity needs to kind of move?
I'm saying the zeitgeist needs to be at integral. Yeah.
I see. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So looking at today's current political spectrum system, everything going on, where do you see where do you see your mission at, is to get sort of your ideas out there, or where do you see slowly your ideas kind of trickling into today's worldview, and what, like, how are you promoting your ideas in today's culture?
Well, I still write on Panarchy and integral economics through my blog. Primarily, we're at the education stage. To be honest with you, I don't see us anywhere near integral Panarchy at the moment. We've got a lot of growing to do, and we've got a lot of we've got some dark days ahead, I guess is the best way to put it. But I think that just continuing to discuss the issue, and really, because integral is the leading edge, my hope is that more integral people start to think about, okay, I get how what the philosophy of integral is, and sort of the psychological development of people and societies as they develop, and also, the spiritual side and all of that. How does that translate to on the ground? How does that translate to our world and our day-to-day society and politics and all of that? Getting more people to think about that, and then introducing them to these ideas, I think is I guess my mission, or what I try to do. It's hard to do that. I try to do that primarily through my blog and now through the podcast, but it's hard to do that in a world where right now, especially, everything is so chaotic. And like if you go to the integral Facebook groups that are out there, it's just a lot of sort of hashing through current events, and then in that case you get people who are, I would say, not necessarily any more or less integral, but their integral lens is flavored by a certain type, and then they're fighting that out. So I think that's just natural. I mean, I don't think you can really avoid that.
I kind of wanted to go back and ask you about the Panarchy Charter or Constitution, and how you see that kind of, I guess, how would we say?
Yeah.
Like, is that something that would organically emerge as different communities contract into it, like an interstate compact, or how do you see that going?
Yeah, I think it could organically emerge. I think it would. My idea of it would be, unlike our Constitution or our federal government, it would be a contract where basically you couldn't add anything to it, but you could take away from it, if that makes sense. So you could say that the contract or the compact, the charter, is at a minimum a guarantee that you can choose your community. You can choose to form a community, you can choose to leave your community, you can choose to join another community, right? That's sort of the bare minimum, and the reason why that is because you wouldn't want to create a situation where someone is trapped in their community and they can't leave, because that defeats the whole purpose, right? So beyond that, the actual communities themselves would have to decide their system of law, their system of what rights they do or don't uphold, and so on and so forth. So the primary right is of course the right to your life, and the right to go where you wish and align with the community that makes sense for you. And then beyond that, the individual communities have the right or the onus to kind of to function how in as healthy a way as possible. And then you would sort of have maybe a type of ostracism might not be the right word, but so let's say you've got one community that's kind of going in an unhealthy direction or a pathological direction, and then the other healthy communities around it can adjust its course simply by their interactions with that community. So for example, by restricting trade, or by refusing to let that community transact with others in their community, and so on and so forth. So you can kind of imagine, like, you know, if these guys over here are, you know, I don't know, let's say abusing children or something like that, then, and we want to correct that behavior, or we don't think that behavior is appropriate, then what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, us as a community no longer trades with that community, and we won't have dealings with them. And then other healthy communities do the same thing, and suddenly they're ostracized, and that would create a sort of incentive to change, to grow. So I think the real point of the Panarchy or in the charter is that you don't force necessarily change on anyone, but you use the tools that you have to encourage that change in a healthy direction.
So Bryan, you wrote this on your blog here. It says, stop trying to make socialism integral. It's not. And you also said socialism in its various 20th century forms has been the most deadly evil ever foisted on humanity by its own hands. I was wondering sort of if you could expand on that.
Sure. So in that piece, I was pointing to socialism in all the ways that it's been tried around the world. And my impetus for writing that was the various, what I saw around the integral community is the various attempts to say that the ideal political arrangement for an integral society would be a socialist arrangement. And
when you say all socialism, do you also include the Nordic countries?
Well, no, because I don't think the Nordic countries are actually socialist,
Okay.
at least not in the traditional sense.
You mean like authoritarian socialism?
Correct. Yeah.
I see.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what I'm talking about, really, because, and here's the thing about my view of socialism. I'm actually fine with socialism, especially in a voluntary context. Like if there's in a panarchy, for example, if a community wants to be socialist, I think that's awesome. And I'm totally for that. But much like the kind of government that we have today, it's traditionally been, or it's historically been, of an authoritarian nature, and that I'm opposed to. So when I see integralists talk about socialism as sort of an ideal, I react to that in the sense that I see it as just another sort of authoritarian push for sort of another version of authoritarianism.
But you would be okay with like democratic socialism?
Well, I wouldn't be okay with any first tier, including democracy, as an overarching sort of framework for
so democracy is first tier?
I would say so, yeah.
Okay, why is it not second tier in your opinion?
Because it doesn't, well, democracy, of course, is mob rule. Essentially, it's 50%, 51%, I guess, decide what happens in a society for the other 49. And so I don't see that as any better necessarily. I mean, it's maybe the best first tier system we've come up with, possibly, but I certainly wouldn't say it's second tier, because it still uses authoritarianism to reach its goals. In other words, at the end of every decision that the government makes, there's a gun.
Well, as a fellow pro-anarchist, I certainly agree that the state is defined by its coercive capacity to enact law, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, see, like, I understand the distinction here when a lot of integral folks are talking about socialistic implementation of particular policies or particular economic restrictions. especially in the United States, for the most part, I think most folks are advocating for a kind of light form of democratic socialism that isn't already existent in the Nordic countries, of course, or an example in Canada is another example. I mean, some form of universal healthcare, some form of kind of basic support structure, kind of bottom line kind of thing. Not really asking for much more, especially in the United States, when those ideas are so controversial that to even advocate for some basic centrist economic policies that would be in like a European nation, Western Europe, are considered more radical, right? So how do you see, I guess, like ultimately, yeah, like an evolved post-state, post-civilization society, right? That is beyond the coercion of the state is a wonderful ideal or principle, and even a kind of primordial view of like human nature, that we are extremely adaptive, creative, social beings, and we can make and unmake the worlds that we participate in, and that we should have the freedom to do that. But as we're getting there, how do we get there, right? So is it wrong to say that transitional implementations of, say, socialistic oriented policies are really so bad as we're trying to move beyond, let's say, the cronyism that we see today? I mean, you could take one extreme being and say that capitalism is just going to produce that kind of, there is no such thing as crony capitalism, it's just the logic of capitalism. Or you could say, well, capitalism needs restrictions. But in this transitional period, what do you see as sort of integral oriented policy implementations to help us get out of this pickle, as it were?
So my, and I'm not saying this is the solution, but one of the things sort of, I did the exercise of sort of saying, okay, how do we get from here to there? And I really like the ideas of Samuel Conklin III, Sec 3 is how he's called in some circles, but and those are that's the idea of counter economics, and I talked about that in one of my podcasts. But basically, the idea is that you have almost like you have the four quadrants. You have these different markets, right? You have the white market, the gray market, the red market, the black market, and you can divide these markets up. The white market would be sort of the legal and non-coercive market. The gray would be the illegal and non-coercive market, and then the black would be the let me make sure I get this right. Actually, sometimes I have to kind of make sure I got all my ducks in a row. I actually have to go down to where I wrote about this. Let's see. Yeah. So yeah. Okay. So the white market is the above board regulated market, right, where most of our transactions take place. So right, it's regulated. Regulated would mean it's violent in nature because it's got the state above it. It's got the state controlling it, right? So you're it's where you pay your taxes. It's where you get your paycheck, apply for various licenses, that sort of thing. The gray market is the unregulated market, where goods or services are traded non-violently. They don't have the shadow of the state looking over them. Things like gift economies, having your neighbor babysit for you, the neighbor kid mowing your lawn, garage sales, that sort of thing, right? Basically, it's under the radar of the state. It's not being regulated by it. The black market is also illegal, or is illegal but nonviolent. So it's sort of transacting things, doing transactions without the required paperwork, and then also these transactions might be illegal. Like, so for example, you might engage in prostitution or sell drugs or buy Cuban cigars or raw milk or any number of things that are technically illegal, but they don't hurt anyone, right? And then you have the red market, and the red market is both illegal and violent. So those are the things that that we never want to get into: racketeering, fraud, scams, cons, assassination, murder for hire, that type of stuff. That would be your red market. So what counter economics says is, okay, let's focus on the gray and the black markets. That's where we want to try to do most of our interacting. Avoid the red market, avoid the white market. So, and by doing that, you thereby weaken the state apparatus. You weaken the sort of the first tier pathological state that is causing all the problems, from my point of view, anyway. And so over time, you have sort of these transition phases. So if we were to go from like where we're at to Panarchy, the first stage would be sort of is actually kind of where we're at now, where we have where we have basically the concept of Panarchy, but we're trapped in this current paradigm. And during that phase, what you're trying to do is basically just kind of educate people and kind of get the word out and get people to understand what it is and sort of what it can do. And then the second stage, the phase sort of this going beyond that, would be, okay, now we have an invisible minority. We have a minority of people who are on board, and maybe they're creating their own little communities, intentional communities here and there, perhaps, or they're somehow banding together in sort of network groups to start to interact this counter economics. They're trading with each other. Maybe they're using things like Fiverr, or they're using other systems that are already, I mean, we have tons of systems that are in place that could help bring this about. They're using Bitcoin. They're doing all kinds of different things that sort of allow these transactions to happen. But we're still a minority, and it's not big enough that the state is maybe even aware of it, or there are no red flags or alarm bells going off. We're sort of starting to get there and showing people that it can be done, right? It's demonstration projects, basically. Then the next phase after that is those demonstration projects and so on grow to the point where they become a noticeable threat. And it's like, suddenly the state's not ignoring you anymore. Now suddenly they understand what's going on. They see the threat, and they're reacting. And this is sort of the dangerous phase where, the media of course, the media as the state's bullhorn, right? They start characterizing you poorly, or, basically drumming up support against you and all that kind of stuff. And there may be a period where, these things have to kind of go underground or whatever. But ultimately, because they work so well, assuming they do, because they work so well, they continue to grow and continue to weaken the power of the state. And of course, at the same time, because the only recourse of the state is essentially violence, and they have to make examples of people, that just ends up hurting them in the long run, because no one wants to see people just standing back on their rights trying to live their lives get arrested. It's one thing to arrest rioters or arrest people who are destroying things or whatever. It's a whole other thing to arrest people who all they're doing is just, they're just trying to live their lives, drink raw milk or whatever, live on a commune or something. I mean, they're just doing their thing, and they get waxed. So that doesn't help the state's cause. And then finally, you get to a point where you have, I'd say, maybe 50% or more of the economy is in this counter economics realm. And at that point, tax revenues for the state are way down. The state is weakened. There are probably other alternatives to the state that have been developed by these counter-economic activities, alternatives that supplant the necessary functions of the state. So whatever those may be, whether it's crime prevention or defense or healthcare, schooling, whatever you would consider to be, the responsibility of the state now. I think you would see a lot of those things kind of popping up within the Panarchy as it develops. And then at sort of the final stage, the state itself kind of shrinks to the point where it almost becomes another entity within the Panarchy. So that, there may be still hundreds of thousands, millions of people that consider themselves citizens of the US, but the US is no longer able to territorially control everyone else. They've basically lost the power and the ability to project that power on what they consider their territory or their own citizenry. So it's kind of a long road. I don't know if I discuss all of that in an article or an essay on Integral World called "The Peaceful Path to an Integral Society." This is where I kind of talk about all that and lay that out. But to me, and I say this in the article, that's just kind of, if I'm thinking about it and kind of thinking through it, that's how one way I could see it happening. But I'm by no means saying, that's how it's going to happen or that's how it needs to happen. I just think counter economics could be a very powerful tool that we could use to make that change.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've never heard of the red market before. That's or gray market. So I was thinking about my own life, and I think most of my time in Portland has been participating in the gray market. So I'm glad I have a label, to
Nice.
label that, right? I'm participating in Bryan's revolution here.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, and it's funny because it's a 4-quadrant approach, which is of course cool. But
right.
I mean, you basically have on one side you have the authoritarian methodology versus the libertarian methodology, and then you have you have violence and the violent and non-violent methodologies, and then you have authoritarian and or regulated and unregulated, basically.
So my question is, how do we think about the same pathway to a panarchy or an integral society, but instead of from an economics perspective, we look at it from a cultural perspective, right? I'm thinking about the culture wars now in the U.S. kind of at an all-time worst of
fever pitch,
just the fracturing, the divisiveness, the polarization. People talk about, are we gonna have a race war or a civil war, right? And my question that I've been thinking about a lot lately is like, okay, what do we do with this energy? Do we just allow it to fracture, and maybe in that fracturing, in that complete splintering, we end up at a kind of panarchy, or is there still a place for national unity or cohesion on a cultural level or on a collective level, not necessarily on a state level, but just on a should we double down on taking pride as Americans, try to band together with our neighbors, or should we just let the whole thing go to shit and then let a panarchy emerge from the ashes?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't know if I have the best answer. I think that integralists have been described as an observer tribe. I don't know if you know that kind of frame, but and I think that's our really all we can do at this point, because whatever is going to happen, whatever we do, it's almost too late for us to do anything, because no matter how much we put out there that's sort of sanity scream of sanity in the darkness or whatever, it's just going to be a drop in the bucket. I mean, you've got forces at play that are way beyond what really we can do anything about, and they aren't. Every so often we have these sort of memetic shifts and a lot of, and historically they have always been accompanied by war. And so, you know, it's in 2012, I was writing about this, saying basically, you know, I would of course hope and dream that we could move from where we are to an integral society without having to go through these upheavals, but that might just be the natural course of things, as dark as that is. It may just be sort of a necessary birth pain. I hope that's not the case, but it could be. I have to, you know, I have to include that possibility in my view. So, so I don't know, man. I think I think that these culture wars are just going to get worse, and I think no matter what happens, whether Biden wins the election or whether Trump wins the election, I don't think I don't think it's going to be smooth by any means. So I hate to be. I saw your podcast with Rob, by the way, and I actually agree with him quite a bit on sort of how things are going to play out. And so I don't want to be too terribly pessimistic, but it's not looking good, unfortunately.
I guess to go back to something you said earlier that I'm curious about. You mentioned that democracy is basically mob rule.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess expanding on that, I mean, would you consider yourself anti-democratic?
I don't really consider myself anti anything, to be honest. You know, there are many ways that you can organize a social unit. Maybe democracy is the best of those ways, but the larger the social unit, the worse it gets, because you are alienating more and more people as you grow larger. So in the US, where we have 300 plus million people, and people, not only 300 plus million people, but we're talking about an extremely diverse population, not a homogeneous population like, say, Scandinavia or Japan. It's much more difficult to, I think, make that work. America isn't a democracy anyway. I mean, I think you guys know that, but it's a republic, a constitutional republic. We don't do majority votes to to choose our leaders. We have, you know, except maybe in the states at the state level to choose representatives. But as far as the president goes, that's done with an electoral college, which is, I know, controversial in this day and age. But the reason that was done, of course, was because, you know, I think the original founding fathers knew that that a democracy, you know, where you're just talking about a 50-50 vote, has its drawbacks, and especially in this day and age, where you have, again, like I said, all of these separate states, and even within states, you have, you know, different communities and so on and so forth that are just so diverse, so different. It just, I don't think it works well. That's not to say
we're a representative democracy, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But even then, I mean, so let's say, so I live in Oregon, right? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I live in Oregon. No vote I've ever cast has ever mattered, because mm-hmm. Oregon's a blue state. It doesn't matter what I do. You know, I could vote for Trump. I could vote for the unity ticket, which I really like. Actually, I might end up doing that. I could vote for anything, but it doesn't matter, because in Oregon's going to go for Biden anyway.
I definitely agree with you in the reform of electoral college. I definitely think I'm definitely in support of that. But, you know, looking back, if, you know, you look at the founding fathers and stuff, you know, I think only property owners could vote, Black people couldn't vote, women couldn't vote. And you see over time, there's been an increase in democracy. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just curious just why that seems like a bad idea. Even if there is minority
Well, ultimate,
communities, they
I
still
see.
have
Yeah, no, I
votes
see
and
what you're saying.
support.
I actually agree with what you're saying as far
Yeah.
as the potential actors that can sort of decide what happens in their society. So, and that even you can go back further. So you say, at sort of pre-conventional level of development, you had your chiefs, your autocrats, your dictators, and then that dispersion of power went from dictatorship to aristocracy, right, where you had a sort of bigger layer or bigger spread of people who hold political power. And then you go to modern systems of government where it's representative democracy, like you just said, where we elect representatives to go to serve in the government to represent us. At least technically, that's how it's supposed to work, right? Well, I think the sort of the next evolution of that would be something where you have the power to, and we have the technology to do this. What if I could just vote in Congress? A bill comes up and I open up my little app on my phone and I just vote, or something like that. You can kind of see that happen. The problem is, again, like with all democracies, the problem I run into is how do you protect the minority? Because you don't want to just have a democracy where at any given time 50% of the vote carries, and 51% of the people could decide to imprison the other 49 or something like that. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but you can see where you need some system in place so that the minority can maintain their rights without having them taken away by the majority in a democracy.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the counter that, being an oligarchy, if you have, Trump, for example, being voted in by the minority of the voters, then what about the majority that are losing their representation?
Right. Yeah. It's an all around bad situation. So, which is why personally in my ideal world, we wouldn't have any of that. We'd be free to, and again, that's what I see as the advantage of Panarchy is, the reason why there's such angst in our country is because the people who don't support the current regime feel disenfranchised and alienated from their own society. And so how do we get rid of that? Or how do we rectify that? Well, I think that, the way to do that is to allow people to create the society that they want, right? They prefer, with other like-minded people, and just let them see how that goes. Let them do what they want to do. That's what it boils down to for me. I mean, as long as they're not hurting anyone else, just let them do what they want to do, and then don't make them support what they don't want. So, if I'm a taxpayer, right? I pay my taxes. I don't want my tax money going to bombing people in the Middle East, or going to have huge, gigantic, militaries, or any number of other things that I don't want, that I don't want to pay for. But I could see pitching in for, universal healthcare or something like that. I mean, that might be something I'd be willing to pay for. Well, as it stands, none of us have any choice in the matter. No real choice anyway. The best we can do is hope that our guy makes it into office. And even then, once he gets into office, he has very little power to make those kind of changes. So,
Kind of curious what your thoughts are on the other side of this equation, which isn't just the limitations and constrictions of the coercive state, but what happens when, and we've seen this historically, the deregulation of corporations in the private sector. How do we, because I see them as two kind of obstacles to this panarchist society. One is completely deregulated corporate sector, extractive capitalist corporate sector, which wants to be deregulated and gains more power over us and our own sovereignty and our own ability to make our own choices here. And then on the other hand, we have the state as well, and they're kind of married together in a somewhat democratic corporate state, right? And we've seen this as a sort of the natural unfolding logic as we're entering, you know, the multi-crises of the 21st century, where, you know, being democratic is sort of optional, right? We're learning this from China in terms of, you know, the kind of authoritarian capitalism that can really kind of begin to creep up. So I'm curious about tackling this other side, which is the question mark for me, which is how do we, if we remove the state, how do we also ensure that collective action is still possible, A, and then B, how do we actually get around the other Leviathan in the room, right, which is completely free reign corporate capitalism, which has no interest in collective well-being or a panarchy, et cetera.
Yeah, I think for me, I would characterize, or I see it a little bit differently in the sense that I don't think corporations want necessarily deregulation. I think what big corporations want is to control the levers of power. They want the ability to define what the regulations will be in order to keep competitors from driving them out or from taking their market share. So, and I know this is this gets into sort of the disagreement between market anarchists and socialist anarchists, I think, to a large degree. But in my view, if you take away the levers of power to begin with, those corporations no longer have the ability to sort of manipulate the rules of the game. So
become their own fiefdoms in the way, like they become their own state.
They just don't have the power because all a corporation can do is try to convince you to buy their product. Unless, of course, they try to become a state within themselves. Like if they were to try to say, hold some territory, build themselves a military, and then force the people within that territory to consume their products. That's what a government does. So, barring that a corporation somehow morphs itself into a state, there really is no way for them to force anything on anyone. All they can really do is just say, "Hey, can please buy my stuff," you know, and then it's up to us as you know, consumers, so to speak, to either do that or not. So, you know, one of the things that you know, I guess I don't have that fear of corporations because I see it being in business myself. I know, for example, that, and of course my business is small, very, very small, but nevertheless, I still have to deal with the regulations that are put in place by bigger corporations. And I know why they put those regulations in place. They put those regulations in place so that I have trouble growing and competing with them, you know, so, and I see that every day. And so I think, you know, and you may disagree with me on this, but yeah, I just think it's not so much of a concern. Once you take the levers of power away, there's nothing for them to pull. There's nothing for them to pull on to do those.
Can you share what that regulation is, for example?
Like in my life?
For you personally, yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So, for example, I run a plumbing company, and there are rules and regulations about the people that I hire. So I can only hire people. So, okay, there's a plumbing licensor there's like a 4-year program to get a license to be a plumber. Okay. And so there's an apprenticeship. There's a 4-year apprenticeship. You go to school, you go through this apprenticeship, and when you come out of it, you become a licensed plumber, right? And then there's a ratio that you have to, by law, there's a ratio that you have to maintain where you can only have a certain number of apprentices in relation to the number of journeyman plumbers that you have in your company. And so I can't hire an apprentice, for example, without having a certain number of journeymen, right? And the reasoning given for this is that at all times the apprentices need to have a journeyman training them at their job. Okay, and that makes sense to a degree, but the ratios are set such that you basically have to have twice as many journeymen as you have apprentices, right? You have to have all, you basically, it's very constricting. Well, this does two things. It limits the market of journeymen available because there's a bottleneck where only a certain number of apprentices can even exist because there's only a certain number of journeymen, right? So you have this bottleneck where people who might want to get into the trade, they have to wait a year or 2 years just to get into the apprenticeship. And so their ability to progress, their ability to, seek higher wages and so on and so forth is constricted by their inability to get into the apprenticeship because of this bottleneck. And at the same time, my ability to meet the demand that we're seeing in, people calling us and saying, hey, I need my toilet fixed, or I need, whatever. My ability is hampered because of the small pool of available plumbers and the slow trickle of apprentices through the system. Now, what that also does is that artificially raises the wages of plumbers, which is good for plumbers, but it's bad. It hurts the people getting the plumbing service as well. So, I mean, there's all these sort of things at play in that, and some of them are good and some of them are bad. But that's just one example of how I'm limited in growing based on basically the availability of labor. One good thing that does, though, is that it really, really makes me focus on making sure all of my people are really happy because I don't want them to go anywhere. So, but yeah, and that's just one example. I mean, there are other examples as well. The process for permitting and inspections has become more and more onerous over the years. The reporting that I have to do to, for example, the Bureau of Labor and Industry has become more and more onerous over the years. There are just a number of regulations and things that I have to follow as a small business that is basically really easy for someone who's large because they have sort of that scale where they can have a person that's dedicated to doing XYZ, right? Well, all of that falls on me, right? I have to do all of that stuff. So, it's just a situation where that all of these regulations basically have the effect of making it easier on large companies and more difficult on small companies. That's the end result.
Just to maybe one of my questions, and maybe unrelated to that, was you earlier kind of referenced the state as sort of using the description of pathological. Are there any benefits to the state, in your opinion?
My personal opinion? No, I don't think so.
So you don't see the state as playing a role of aiding growth, or, I mean, we talked about the difference between growth hierarchies and dominator hierarchies. The only thing the state does is pathological and domination.
Yep. Yeah.
So what about education?
Well, the state doesn't do a very good job of that, does it?
Quality wise, I mean, that's a different argument, right? But as far as providing education, is that a benefit?
Well, of course, providing education is a benefit. I don't think you necessarily need the state to do that, though.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think especially in this day and age. I mean, if I wanted to, I could go to MIT, you know, and just watch all of their lectures and do the homework, and you know, I could do all that. Now, I wouldn't get a degree, but all of that stuff is published.
I think what you're really talking about here, though, is a kind of a prefigurative culture. I mean, we can't really imagine a world without the state any more than we can imagine a world without the private sector. They go hand in hand. They're part of, you know, centralized banks, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you're talking about intermediary spaces that are commons centric in the sense that they may not be coercive, but they might be inactive with the cultures that come together in agreement about a particular way of living, right? There may be cultural practices around that. And what we even know about the history of the state, right? The evolution of the state is for 4,000 years, we had urban agro centers that were stateless for 4,000 years before the state began to really kind of innovate itself for various reasons that archaeologists, anthropologists still argue about. So in some ways, we're looking at prefigurative and also kind of in the horizon of our historical imagination. There was a period in which the state did not exist, and then in perhaps anticipatory in the future, there is a society in which the state does not exist. I guess for me is the question is sort of how do we, because where we are, you know, the podcast is called Growing Down, right? So we're really interested in both the prefigurative, the anticipatory, and then also the messiness of the current situation, the process of historical cultural evolution. So when we're talking about public and private sectors, we're talking about removing the levers of power. And yet we know that those levers are still here, right? So I guess for me, the question is like, how do we really kind of make those mediational steps? I know you outlined a particular path in terms of the different types of markets. It seems like maybe the common ground in those markets is really focusing on the commons in terms of these sort of off the books, multi forms of currency, forms of gift economy, forms of decentralized exchange, right? So that's question one. And then the second part of that I'm interested in your thoughts on that topic, maybe with Murray Bookchin's concept of bioregionalism and how maybe that has factored in at all in your thinking.
Yeah, I really like the idea of diversity in the way of doing things. So I love the idea of having different types of economies, whether they're gift economies or barter economies or whatever, sophisticated blockchain type stuff. The more, in my mind, the primary problem with the state is that it is a monopoly, essentially. So so it comes with all of the things that are bad about monopolies. They don't respond well to market signals. They can't respond to market signals because they're not getting market signals, essentially. And so that's why, you know, everything that that the government is, or that the state controls, whether it's, and I know that we have private healthcare in the US, but it is so heavily regulated, you might as well just consider it part of the state. So you're talking about healthcare, you're talking about education, you're talking about the military or the post office or anything else, trains, you know, Amtrak. All of these things have one thing in common, which is that their costs increase over time exponentially. And I think that the reason for that is the lack of market signal. It's the lack of being able to respond to market forces that will make you more efficient, or streamline those things. So, that's why I think, for example, education could be free. I mean, education could be easily free for people, if it weren't controlled by the state, because people would come up with all of these competing ideas and ways of doing things, and things would sort of organically bubble up to the surface, and especially with the technologies we have available. I mean, the sky's the limit. You could. I just don't see anything preventing that from happening, in that sort of system. So I don't know if I'm answering your question there. You were talking about what was the second part of it, Jeremy?
Murray Bookchin and his concept of bioregionalism as one of these kind of proposed forward-thinking solutions.
Yeah, I'm not terribly familiar with that, but I mean, I've heard of bioregionalism. So I don't really know. I don't really know if I have anything to add to that, but
yeah. Just wondering if you're familiar, because it sounds a little, at least somewhat similar to Panarchism, in the sense that he's looking at kind of regional, I'm going to borrow a term from William Irwin Thompson, noetic polities, where basically everyone gathers in a particular region. Maybe it's a city-state, maybe it's a kind of commonwealth of people who have decided to enact a particular type of society. And so there's still this sort of global emphasis, but it's kind of coming from a much more localized and enactive decision about, well, we want to live this way, so our region's going to enact these laws and these principles, etc. So it's much more decentralized in this kind of vision of the future, rather than homogeneity of the state apparatus, right? Now that there may still be problems, obviously, in that particular region, there may be issues that are coercive, etc., but it's much more decentralized than obviously what we have today. But just curious if you're familiar with his writing on.
Yeah, no, I'm not specifically familiar with his writing, although I have read similar stuff similar to that in the past, and I love it. I think it's great. Anything where you can take power and localize it, in my view, is better, because what you want is for the day decisions in your life, or the people that have the most power, I guess, over the day-to-day decisions of your life, to be the closest to you, so that you can actually have the ability to, knock on your mayor's door and say, look, this isn't working for me, or whatever. So the closer you can get to that, and I think that was sort of the way representative government was envisioned by the founders. Of course, the country was a lot smaller, but people knew their representative. They personally, the country was small enough, and and all that people kind of had a, it wasn't so spread out and alienating as it is now. And also, over time, more and more power has shifted from local government to federal government, shifted up that chain. And the more that happens, the worse it gets. And so, and that's why, everyone gets so worked up over the election of a president, or a Supreme Court justice, or something like that, is because they have so much power over our day-to-day lives that they really just shouldn't have. I mean, that all of those things should be, filtered down to lower levels of government, more local levels of government, that people can have more connection with. And it's almost like now, our county governments and our city governments are just superfluous. We don't even pay attention to them, because they don't really, they have no, in a lot of cases, they just have no real effect on our day-to-day lives. All of that's been pushed up the chain.
I would say, to add a caveat, because I think I largely agree that representative power has largely shifted up into the federal and the nationwide rather than the local, and that's been an issue with voter participation, for instance, et cetera. The other side of that, of course, is obviously what we on the left that we've been talking about for the past 40 years, which is a loss concordant with that loss of voter participation on the down ballot. There's also a loss of, again, regulations, workers' rights, et cetera, et cetera. So we have these kinds of two concordant things going on where workers and worker unions, labor rights have gradually been eroded over the past 40 years. On the other hand, we also have lack of voter participation and a kind of apathy in terms of actually participating beyond the 4-year. Every 4 years, there's a kind of collective spectacle in a sense, right? And there's a sort of nihilism about that as well that we saw reflected in like the very low youth turnout during the primaries this year. So
And
I guess,
I'm curious, in what ways do you see workers' rights, for example, being eroded?
oh, well, I think labor unions have lost
They've lost a lot of power.
lot of power. I mean, this is exactly what we're talking about. We've the loss of labor power. There's been a gradual, perhaps, representation of like more woke oriented kind of who's in the gears of power in terms of people of color, maybe more of a feminist push, etc. But really, worker union power has completely eroded. There is no genuine left like there was 30 or 35, 40 years ago. So I guess I'm saying both are going on, right? We're not just seeing the accumulation of federal power, but we're also seeing an accumulation of or deaccumulation of worker and democratic power, right? So I think they both have to be, and that might be the difference that we may have here, which is,
I mean, I guess I have a take on that, which would be just because I associate with a lot of workers, a lot of people in the trades. And I think that the reduction in power of the unions is sort of a result of, over time, the fact that that companies, by and large, have started competing more and more for labor, and it's no longer the case that the unions provide any sort of benefit to those workers. The workers see that and they go, well, okay, why am I paying these union dues and going through all this stuff to be part of a union when my employer is doing everything that I'd ever want him to do? And if he's not, I can just go in and say, hey, I need a raise or whatever to stay with you. So I think that's part of it. I think that the unions in the first part of the century actually performed a really great service for workers, but I don't see them as being very effective actually in their role anymore. And so I don't know that the drop in the power of unions represents a drop in the power of workers, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. I just don't see how that equals the other, and in the sense of this, right? Like, yes, union capacity to actually make demands and make changes has dropped, and you can actually see it. Like what you're talking about, I've been reading in statistics, in that around 1975, 1976, mid 1970s, we began to see a drop in workers' expectations of what they can get from unions in terms of higher raises, higher wages, et cetera, and also concordantly, right, a drop in actual membership. So the less that workers saw they can get out of the union and being a union member, the less they actually decided to participate in that and just drop out. But the result of that has been a kind of atomization of labor, which of course people have been talking about. So, I mean, obviously you work with working class people, so you know what their issues are and what their problems are on a day-to-day basis, right? So would you say that they have, I don't see the statistics in this in terms of, being able to negotiate more, but in terms of healthcare, in terms of wages, in terms of benefits, et cetera, would you say that they're better off than they were when unions were actually stronger and wages were actually higher? In terms of workers individually, without
my experience is highly anecdotal and is based on sort of the trades that I'm involved with. But we have to respond to I have to respond to a labor market, right? I have to respond to what other companies, both union and non-union companies, are doing. So it, you know, just the fact that, for example, the union compensation might be X, right? I have to make sure that my compensation is competitive with that. So even though I'm not a union shop, but I still have to compete with other union shops for the same labor resources, for the same, you know, pool of labor. So so yeah, there's definitely incentive on my end to make sure that I am providing benefits and compensation that's competitive with anyone else out there. Now, unlike in other industries, maybe, in my industry, wages have definitely risen significantly, even in the past 5 years. Wages and benefits have gone way up, and again, that's just an issue of, you know, not only demand for labor, but also demand for services. I mean, we just can't keep up. So in order to keep both our employees happy and, you know, and make sure that we're able to meet people's needs, customers' needs, you know, we're constantly looking at, you know, what are we doing for our people? How could we do better? Da, 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 da. And I think that's a difference between employers maybe today, who, you know, because society is sort of maybe at a higher level of development than it was 100 years ago, right? I think you'd find that there's far less separation between the interests of business owners, employers, and their employees. I think there's not as much of a divergence as there used to be. When the unions were useful was when the labor pool was so large that basically, if you didn't want to work for $1 an hour, and that's just too low for you, then I'll find someone who can, you know. And that's just not the world we live in anymore. We just don't live in that world anymore. I can't do that. I can't say to one of my guys, you know, I'm not giving you a raise, I'll just find someone else. I mean, that's bullshit. There's no way I could find someone else. So, you know.
Right. Yeah. And I wonder though, if there's a difference in like what you said, because we're talking about like different scales of the private sector,
different industries,
right?
sure.
Like, because we hear a lot of stories with bigger corporations, horror
or like
stories.
Walmart might be different.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
Yeah.
So I think obviously it's a complex issue where like maybe at the more localized level, we're being in the private sector is probably healthier anyway. There's more interaction. There's more egalitarian approaches in terms of like, yeah, you've got a boss, but like you said, there might be a consensus. Everyone might be working class, versus something in, let's say, the corporate sector with like Walmart or Amazon, for instance. There's been pushes for worker strikes for the Amazon workers right now, and their safety protocols, etc.
And from that standpoint, I have nothing against unions. If workers want to organize and form a union, I think they should. I think there should, and even in a panarchy, there of course would be no restriction to that, because you know, whatever voluntary organization wants to form can be formed. There's no restrict, you know. So so I'm all for the individual's right to choose to become part of a union. Absolutely, for that. What I am against are laws that require union membership, or that create, you know, there are a lot of laws on the books that that favor union membership. I would say that make it easier for unions and for union shops. And so that sort of stuff, and that's just a result of the voting power of unions. Once a union is formed, of course, they represent a voting bloc, right? And so they can sort of change the pull those levers of power, just like a big corporation can say, and sort of, you know, change the rules of the game. So, so I on that end, I'm not really for that. I don't really like that, but as far as collective bargaining, I think collective bargaining should be a right for anyone. I mean, absolutely.
Any questions, guys? We're coming up at 90 minutes.
Yeah, well, I think we're kind of winding down here, but you know, it's interesting. It's interesting, Brian, because my takeaway from this conversation is that I think there is a lot of agreement on like what the ideal state of society is or what the goal is. I think if anything, the disagreement is very specifically what the role of the state is in getting there in that transition process. But I think in terms of the end goal that we're I know Jeremy was, I think, alluding to, you know, the something like the P2P movement or decentralized peer networks, focusing on the gray market and using the power of voluntary self-organized decentralization to subvert power structures and power monopolies, whether they be corporate hegemonies or government, right? And I think that is the future. I think the difference is, you know, how we get there. So yeah, this was an interesting conversation. I think I have a lot to learn in terms of, you know, understanding your perspective better and integrating that into what I liked was when you were talking about education and how the government can suppress more creative diversity of and innovation of ideas. And, you know, of course, you know, as a progressively oriented person, I would say that most of my radar is on how corporate monopolies could also do the same thing. But I think that adding in, you know, learning how to like wisely deregulate government here and there to promote more organic flowering of ideas, I think is something that I'll think harder on going forward.
Yeah, and I would just put one more thing out there, which is that if we can if we can just recognize that government is a monopoly, just like any other, whether it's a corporate monopoly or any other type of monopoly, it is a monopoly. And if we can just think about it in those terms, then we can see that one of the ways forward is to try and dismantle those monopolies and allow competition in there. To sort of show us, you know, other creative solutions to problems. So, and education is a great place to start. One of the things I'm really for is one thing we could do, I think, and actually the COVID crisis has sort of moved the ball forward on this, because now students are no longer tethered to brick and mortar schools. My kids, they do their schooling online. I know I have neighbors that they gather in small groups and do their schooling in these small groups. But I think that one of the things we could do as a society is say, okay, we still want to fund education. We want public education available to everyone. Let's fund it, but let's let the money follow the child. In other words, wherever that child ends up, whether that child becomes homeschooled or goes to another private school or goes to a public school or wherever they go, charter school, anything, the money that the state provides for that child's education follows the child. And I mean, I think that's something that I would hope that all sides of the political spectrum could get behind.
Yeah, that's a good. Sorry, Ryan.
Oh, I was just gonna say really quickly. Yeah, we're interviewing Zach Stein next Saturday, and I don't know if you're familiar with his work or his book, but in his book Education in Time Between Worlds, his vision of education is basically like a decentralized networks, with, you know, teachers who are like citizen scientists and in a very local way. So we'll get into it, and I'll send it to you and see what you think about it.
Yeah, that'd be. I'd love to watch that. Yeah.
Good. Before I let Matt jump in, just gonna say as well, like, I do think that is the conversion point, which is, for me, and I kind of agree with Michelle Bowens on this, like the role of the state is to become an intermediary bridge for the commons, right? For these new economic and social innovations. Now, how we get there, whether it's deregulating or kind of getting it out of the way or using it to foster the commons, like we're kind of talking about it this way, right? Like fostering projects that, whether it's private, et cetera. There's different ways about that. And that seems to be the interesting common ground that Jason Snyder, I don't know if you heard our talk with Both End podcast, but that's something that Jason Snyder brought up. Like, how can both the left and the more libertarian conservative elements of communities, they're both kind of focusing on decentralization and bioregionalism, or however we call it, right? So there seems to be room here because we're all going to have to live in this world together, right? So it's like, where do we find that common ground, and where do we have a healthy battle of ideas in terms of like how to get there, right? So yeah. Matt, sorry, want to jump in?
No, I was just going to say thanks, Bryan, for being on the podcast. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thanks, Bryan.
Thanks,
Bryan.
Thanks for having me.